Hello and welcome to Bingley Talks Politics. We've had a little break, haven't we, the last couple of weeks, no podcast, but we're back, we're still here and we're still talking politics. And as luck would have it, there's been some activity I hear going on in the country to do with politics recently. And we're going to discuss a few issues there, okay? So I'm joined by Mr. Cook.
Hello.
I'm joined by Finn.
Hello.
And the first question is, Rishi Sunak is the new Prime Minister. Will he be a success?
He's got a better chance than Liz Truss, right? I think the one gift I had over the holiday was that they got rid of her quicker than I thought they would. If I was a betting man, I'd have lost a lot of money, but turned out they moved a lot quicker than they did with Boris. I think Rishi has a lot of issues facing him, same as Liz Truss did. The one advantage he's got on her is that he seems very well steeped in economics, which is something she clearly wasn't. He understands stuff like gilts and finances, but it is a big task ahead of him. So.
Yeah, he does have a big task. They talk about a honeymoon period. Finn, do you think he's in one at the moment?
I think potentially is. You know, Rishi's, if you go back to the time of the pandemic, people absolutely loved him then. He was basically a celebrity.
He did come across as quite popular, didn't he?
Yeah, he was. So perhaps he is going through that now. But then the thing is that you always see is that as a party, you know, obviously the Conservatives won the 2010 election in 2010, and we're 12 years into that now, and people, once you get to this kind of time, once the party's been this long in government, people just start to get sick of
yeah, it's hard to keep that going, isn't it? So it's he's got an opportunity clearly, hasn't he? Mm. And as I think we've mentioned before, they like to brand themselves as a new government, even though there are some people who were in the last government, and Rishi Sunak was, up until very recently, a big member of the last government, but it's all new. It's almost like they won an election. Whether that can actually have a long-term effect is not really clear. So he's got some challenges. What are his main challenges then, as the next 2 years? If he's got, you know, we don't think he's going to call an election, do we? Because the pressure might build to call an election, depending on what happens. But let's assume that there isn't an election in the near future. What's Sunak got on his plate to deal with? What are the major issues?
I think from a policy perspective, the economy is obviously there, but the big one that isn't a policy thing is basically winning another mandate, a historical mandate for the Tory party again. You've had 2010, then you had again in 2015, 2017, 2019. This will be the fifth time they've won an election.
Well, that's interesting. So let me just ask a question on that. Do you think there's a danger, might be the word, that the government might look at what could be seen as popular to get votes, whereas that might clash with what's perhaps the better thing to do for economic stability? Do you think there's a potential clash there that Sunak might have interesting decisions to make?
Yeah, I mean, I was hearing something, and that we're going to delay austerity and cuts 2 years, which is when the election would be if he doesn't call it, which would mean that these cuts, all of the bad things, they would come if Labour won that election.
Right, yeah, save them for later, sort of thing.
Exactly. So potentially he could do that. But it's going to be if he does it, it'd be very difficult because he needs to get inflation down. The IMF has said that the underlying cause of most of the crisis that we're in is inflation. And if he doesn't tackle that, they're just going to keep getting worse and they'll stay worse. So he has to do something about it if he wants a legacy at all. It would be very difficult for him to delay it and come out of this well, basically.
Yeah, and I suppose he's got a challenge there because whilst the economic situation might improve, I think everybody, or most people in the country, recognise that we're in for uncertain times, quite difficult times. Some people are quite worried about inflation, as you've mentioned, Finn, and wages not matching it, and how bad will this get? And say the situation does improve, and say Sunak does have some policies that stabilise things and get things better. It might not seem like that to the electorate, though.
I think you made a great point, Finn, in the sense they got elected in 2010 on a mandate of basically cutting the national debt down, solving this issue first by making everyone miserable, right? And then 12 years later, we've got a Tory Prime Minister saying he'll get the debt down and sort the finances out and make everyone miserable. I think you said it yourself as well, that he's known kind of for his COVID policies. So unlike Liz Truss, who came to the Premiership and she had to kind of make an identity for herself and get everyone, and it went down very badly because the first thing she did was cut these taxes and dip everything into, a black hole. Rishi, though, has the advantage of that people do seem to perceive him as like he will make the people with the broadest shoulders pay. Whether he does now as Prime Minister is different, but things like the furlough scheme, he had to help out, I guess, even though the issues
quite an interesting point, that perception. If you liken it, I was just thinking when you were talking, is it a bit like, they talk about interviews, or when you first meet someone, you form this impression quite quickly, and they say it's quite powerful. There's some sort of number, isn't there, they take, it's quite quick, isn't it, the first impression. I wonder if that has some similarity to Sunak and the first impression that many people, I don't know what share of the electorate, has this idea that he is competent and trustworthy with the country's money, and that will help him in the longer term. I don't know.
Well, it's similar with Gordon Brown, I think, right? After he took over from Blair, people had experienced him as a very competent chancellor that had managed to provide for the public services, but at the same time ensure that you would have these rising debt levels, supposedly. So he came to office, and I can't remember at the time, but my dad always says it felt like he had a firm hand on the teller. You had the foot and mouth outbreak, didn't you? Not long after he took over, flooding and stuff. And he seemed to be a crisis manager, someone who could really get to grips. But then it wasn't long till that kind of wore off and the public's perception turned very, very nasty against him. Brown the bottler, Brown.
And as we've mentioned before, I think it's still events that you don't know are going to happen and how you deal with them. And it's a sort of personal challenge, isn't it? Has he got the characteristics? The job is what you make of it, what the holder brings to it. And does Sunak? I don't think we know enough, really, perhaps, about his personal characteristics and how he can cope with the demands of the job. I mean, he's done big jobs in government, so that will help, you would think. Hasn't been leader of the party till now. Has never been leader of opposition or anything like that. So that's again, that might be quite difficult. Well, while we're talking about characteristics, let's contrast. Apparently, there was a prime minister we had called Liz Truss. Do you remember? It was a strange thing, this. The Truss era. I think we should just contrast perhaps with the Truss era. And, how should we remember the Truss era? That's the question. Will we remember the Truss era?
Wow, I mean, it was just like, as somebody who really enjoys watching politics, it was just amazing. It was, but at the same time, it was scary because it actually shows the fragility of government and how sort of unstable it is. Government is, in effect, a perceived thing, and Liz Truss, you could say that she was a perceived prime minister as well, because she really, effectively from day one, she was doomed. Basically, she was doomed from the very start. She didn't have any of the personal or kind of personality characteristics to come across well. She was backed up by the Institute of Economic Affairs, which was this think tank, which has basically for 50 years been planning policy for government. And then on the 7th of September this year, they had it all right. They had Truss who was backing them. They had the Chancellor who was backing them. As soon as she comes into government, she implements their policy that they've been preparing for 50 years. And the government gets destroyed in 45 days.
Yes, it was an interesting one. I mean, the two things that struck me, and I think it's a fairly objective thing, this, to consider, is communication skills, ? And judgment, timing, ? The tax cutting, the growth agenda that she was championing, it just seemed to be... So this is called square peg round hole analogy, or just the wrong timing. Agreed?
Yeah, I mean, I've got actually know people that work at the IEA, and they admit that they basically ditched her as soon as that mini budget went. That people were sat there in the office watching the sterling crash, watching gilts fly up, and they were just sat there going, "Yeah, maybe we were a bit too radical with what we were proposing. Maybe we should have just left out the bankers' bonuses stuff.
And I think it was an interesting example of how politicians behave, because irrespective of the economic debate, whether cutting taxes is a good or bad idea, let's not get so detailed into that now. But what I thought with her Chancellor of, well, I don't know how many days he did, because he did less than her. Is it 49 that she did in total?
I think it's less, isn't it? 44.
It was 44, but then do you count her?
Oh, okay.
She hung on for a bit until she
Yes.
officially was.
The lame
Anyway,
period.
so Kwarteng, the Chancellor, who resigned, was forced out. I thought the politics of it was a big question mark, and I remember him coming across as really dismissive, and I thought, irrespective of what you want to do, irrespective of the actual whether it's a good or bad thing to do for the country, cut tax and so forth, he just seemed to handle it in a very bizarre way. And generally, when you do that and appear quite almost arrogant, perhaps, it doesn't tend to sit well, really, does it?
No, and I think it sort of raises quite a good point that talent in the Conservative Party for the past 6 years, because obviously when the Brexit referendum happened and Theresa May, she was the first Prime Minister that did this, first of many Prime Ministers that did this, and she only really brought in people into a cabinet who were Brexiteers. Now, what that effectively did was it wrote off half of the parliamentary party because they voted Remain for the simple reason that they voted Remain. So there's kind of been basically a lot of dismissal of talent. So people like Jacob Rees-Mogg, Kwasi Kwarteng, they've only had ministerial posts for a few years. I don't think I will be being controversial in saying that they aren't good politicians. They don't have much experience, they haven't really prepared for it. They've kind of just been brought up into the cabinet because they tick all the right boxes. Right, you're a Brexiteer, you're in. And I think Kwarteng is an example of that. He's not really a good politician. He's obviously came across as quite arrogant, and he obviously really messed things up. And I don't think he had the natural talent or ability to be Chancellor. It's just because he suited Liz Truss's economic ideas and he was a Brexiteer.
It all just seemed to be a mix of things that were... I don't know if it is hindsight, I don't know how quickly you develop hindsight with this, just a mix of things that looked like they would go wrong, and it was a matter of when and not if. Now, someone else who cropped up, lo and behold,
He's back.
people were talking about, wait for it, Boris Johnson, another former Prime Minister, and there were rumours, more than rumours, weren't there? He put himself forward to become leader of the Conservative Party and then again Prime Minister. Well, is he gone for good now in terms of his leadership ambitions? What do we think?
I think so, unless Sunak fails. But even then, I think if Johnson would have won the leadership election, he'd have been Prime Minister for about 2 weeks, because the party would just not have had it. Now, if he'd have gotten 100 MPs, which was the amount of MPs he needed to get onto the ballot, and if he'd have gone to the membership, I think it might have been fairly likely, potentially, that he could have been the Prime Minister, but not for long, because the Conservative Party at the moment is a sick beast, really. It's going through sort of this withdrawal symptoms, basically. It's in a fin de siècle period where it's just things aren't going right, and things aren't going to suddenly get better for it.
I think that's a really good point, and I think that's another challenge for Sunak, managing the party, because he is the leader of the party and thus becomes Prime Minister, and you shouldn't forget that element of the job, leader of the party, which isn't particularly... Well, it seems united to a degree around him, but how long that will last, we don't know. I just think there might be tension. One thing I'd be interested to watch out for would be, as it moves towards the next election, would be the Red Wall, which are the seats in the north that the Conservatives largely in the north, managed to get at the last election, combined with the more traditional Tory heartlands of the home counties into Surrey and the south. You've got different, and I'm generalising, different sort of voter here, expecting different things. and it's whether they can match both of those things. 'Cause this isn't going to be a Europe Brexit election, the next one, is it? It's largely going to be about economics, cost of living election. And therefore, can they say the right things to both of those groups and be convincing to both those groups? Because, again, generalising, but the person in the sort of more northern constituency might be looking out for different things than the person in the maybe slightly more affluent southern-based constituency. Do you think that's something that's going to be difficult?
I think that is probably the most interesting thing going forward, whether this coalition that basically began in 2016 with the referendum, this voting bloc coalition, the idea of these working class red wall seats, and that election that Boris won in 2019 with the 80-seat majority, whether the Tories can take that and turn it into a long-term viable coalition.
Because it's obviously very unusual, a government of that number of seat majority, to lose the next election.
And it's not hilarious. It would be funny if it wasn't so serious. But they had 80 seats. Whether you like the Tories or not, they had an 80-seat majority. They could have been quite transformational with the state of the country if they were willing to and could be bothered. But Partygate, COVID, Brexit squabbles, everything else has meant that now we're on 2022 and they've got 2 years left. And I think if they want to have any chance of winning any majority in the future, they need to start delivering. Because it's been 12 years, like you said, and we're in the exact same position we were in 2010.
I think it's a challenge for the opposition then, isn't it, to see how 2 or 3 things they need to do, present themselves obviously as a credible alternative, but challenge maybe the government on certain things. Levelling up would be an interesting one. There's a minister for levelling up. Is it Michael Gove again? Gove's back. So one of the perceived more talented Conservative ministers has been given that job. So they obviously think it could be an issue where they need to defend and suggest that things have happened. And then, again, the southern voter, again, big generalisation, but they're not so bothered about levelling up as much. And they're interested in, well, what about the issues around here? So there's a sort of pincer movement of, we think, Liberal Democrats in the south targeting certain seats, and maybe the Labour Party trying to win back many of the northern seats, who've got relatively small majorities. So although it was a big win, some of them have got relatively small majorities, I think. Is that
fragile?
Yeah, so it does look... So it's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting.
I think what they're most worried about, is what's happened in Australia with this Albanese fella.
Yeah.
I hear Tories in the press saying, so with this fracking ban they brought back and all COP27 and all this stuff, I hear a lot of Tories saying, if we want to maintain ourselves in power, we need to start targeting those southern votes and going after issues like environmentalism, because we saw what happened in Australia when the Conservatives there downplayed environmental issues.
Yeah, and I think there was a backlash from what was called the Teal movement. Are you familiar with, the sort of more independent, but centre-right, female, largely, well-educated, but reacting against that, saying, no, we're a bit more progressive on certain issues, environment being one of them, and thinking of the future. I just think, I know you realise this, Mr Cook, and I'm so sceptical of the nostalgia that is portrayed, and this sense of nostalgia is that surely it would be interesting if we can get a good narrative about the future, whether that's future jobs, future opportunities for young people like yourself okay, Brexit's happened and many people wanted it, many people didn't want it, but what is next? Where is? And it's not necessarily the blindless optimism, or is it the Johnson boosterism they call it? It's not that came across to me as superficial, but it's about there are new opportunities, there are new industries, and someone that in a sense needs to grip that. And it'd be interested to see whether that's Keir Starmer, whether that's a Tory politician. Well, it's Sunak. I don't know. Can get a handle on that. And I think transmitting that sense of optimism might work.
Yeah, I think one of the things that the centre left as an ideology across Europe has been going through for the past 10, 15 years is that it hasn't really had a cause. It hasn't really had any specific policy to believe in. Now, if you go back in time, we go back to 1997 when Tony Blair won, and 1964 when Harold Wilson won the election. Labour always wins elections, and the centre-left always wins elections when it promises modernism, and that's always such a key part of how you come to power. You need to offer something radical. Now, for the past 12 years, we have not at all thought about the future. We've been looking backwards. Well, I'd say 6 years on that. Because Brexit was that, we were saying, oh, things were better in the 1960s when we weren't in the European Union, and we were looking backwards. And I think now there's a real opportunity. The future is green, and I think people are realising that, and green ideologies are going to merge with socialist ideologies, because I feel like the Labour Party is now taking on this idea of a Green New Deal. In the 1930s, you might have studied it in history, how Franklin D. Roosevelt, he promised this New Deal, this package of measures to reform society. And I think that's what we're...
So that's an interesting potential, isn't it? Yeah, and I think that throws up a lot of issues, such as leadership. Because I think what we've had a lot of recently is what the people want, and that being reflected back on them. Whereas part of the job, I think, of political leaders is to take people with you and to say, well, why don't we, as you say, offer something, and what are the opportunities, and to communicate that. So I think it's going to take some real communication. I think Keir Starmer still struggles with cutting through in his communication on that to really get certain messages home. I think people are still a bit confused about exactly what Labour might be offering on that. New agenda and development, but I think that will be a real test. But that is what leadership can do. I mean, you mentioned FDR, a great communicator of his time, goes down as a legendary president, arguably, and similar, isn't it? Is there someone able to do that? And then people will say, right, okay, well that sounds interesting. Oh, my children or grandchildren, I wonder if they want to be involved in that. It's again taking things forward rather than perhaps looking back. I mean, I think I'll say it now. I think the idea of a buccaneering Britain. This was Ian Duncan Smith, a Conservative, and I'm sorry, this might be party political, but it's nonsense, isn't it? The world's changed, hasn't it? You can't, countries like China will just laugh. Well, Britain buccaneering around the world. I don't think so. I think we've got that role sorted, and various other places too. I just think it's nonsense, really, and I just think the problem of looking back to recreate, as my granddad said, the good old, bad old days is just a problem. So I hope perhaps politics is infused with a different agenda. So, political comeback, no, with Boris, possibly, but we're thinking, let's see, we're thinking maybe he might be done for a bit at least. However, in Brazil, there has been a comeback, hasn't there? Mr. Cook, what do you know about Brazil?
I know probably less than Finn, actually. You're kind of the go-to resident foreign policy expert now when it comes to but from what I do, I mean...
Why do we care about Brazil?
It's a big economy. I think it's the largest in the world still. And Lula's he's got a good track record in the sense of governance. I mean, he actually did something, more I read about him, I'm like, it's quite spectacular what he did with the natural resources and reinvesting it at that moment back into the public services.
There's been a lot going on in Brazil. I mean, let's just simplify it for people who are not aware. That Lula was in charge. I can't remember the year that... He actually got sent to prison, didn't he?
2002 to 2010, wasn't it?
2010 was it. And there was corruption charge at the end. To got a long story short, he was essentially succeeded by Jair Bolsonaro, who was, I think fair to say, a right-wing populist. Controversial, very charismatic, very good at social media. Ran his entire campaign, really, on a very low-budget social media with his family. And whether you like him or not, that's effective. And obviously, I think there was someone in America who did certain things, who's back on Twitter, who's a big admirer of Bolsonaro. So they've had that. And Bolsonaro, I think it's fair to say, whilst popular with some, is very unpopular with others. Big division. And so the Brazilian election says, well, okay, a country can change its mind, and it just seems that certain countries are going back and forth between two very different sets of ideas. Also questions this idea of where next for the populists, for the strong men of world politics. Are they on the wane, or are they still quite a powerful force? What do we think on that one?
I think there's definitely in the coming years, there might be more opportunities for these peak characters to take advantage of disaffection. And I mean, it depends ultimately how current politicians play out, because it does seem like they're on the receding, right? You see it in Germany. I mean, Sweden, we've spoken about that before, kind of an isolated case. But you got Germany, AfD is doing fairly worse than they were a couple of years ago, I think. Macron's still there, you know.
Yeah, there doesn't seem. I mean, there's trends that are applicable in different countries, but then each country's having a slightly different outcome, and they're opting for slightly different things. I mean, obviously we mentioned Italy, but then again, that's unique to a degree, isn't it? And whether that lasts, we talked about. And France, you can't ignore the nationalist and the far right. However, Macron is still relatively secure in that, and that tells a different story to other countries. It was quite close, I think, the Lula-Bolsonaro vote in the end, wasn't it?
I think it was basically 50-49, wasn't it? I think.
It was really close. So, divided country, because they do offer that. And the ideological contest seems to have come back. Is that fair? For many years, the parties had merged quite close. It was quite difficult sometimes to see the distinction, but not anymore? Or not for the moment?
Yeah, I think, it's personality politics, really, isn't it? That's sort of that spearheaded the rise of the far right. Just on the thing about, you know, the waning power of the far right. I think that's a general trend of what you're seeing in Germany, and we might be seeing in France. But I read an article in Politico a few weeks ago, and it made a really good point. The far right isn't losing power. It's just becoming mainstream.
Yeah.
And that's even more dangerous. So I think, you know, Trump and Bolsonaro in Brazil, they're almost kind of ahead of the game, really. They've already been in power, and now they're coming out of power. You're seeing things like France, the far right is... it's dividing into lots of different camps. But I think Bolsonaro... you know, it's an absolutely typical case of how the far right is so based on personality. He's a very militaristic person. He was a big supporter of the military dictatorship in Brazil, and he kind of built his whole voter base on that. Very conservative against the liberal reforms of Lula, seemingly against corruption, although he was very corrupt. Bolsonaro is very corrupt himself. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see where it goes.
Yeah, and again, it's unpredictable, partly because of the, you know, how close the contest was, and clearly whether the opposition will, you know, be quite strong against Lula. And I think it throws into like sort of populism generally. Populism, again, we don't have the time perhaps now to go into massive detail. Isn't necessarily what people think. Someone being popular. A populist is a bit different. I put it like, well, I read it, various things on it. I think one of the best descriptions of populism is where they deny pluralism, really, and what that essentially means is they deny the different viewpoints across society, whether that's political parties or different forms of media, and it has to be generally, you know, there is one way of thinking, and it's the right way, and it's our way. And if you're against that, you're against the country, and they define it quite ethnically. Talk about ethnic divisions being more important, and certainly that has cropped up in various countries. I think there are obviously huge issues that are unfolding over the next few years. Will Trump come back? Bolsonaro, what will happen there? Keep your eye on Europe. That's a really interesting point about the more dangerous if they become perhaps more part of the mainstream, the far right. Although I think we should perhaps finish on this, and this would be whether we do it next week or a future episode, and I think we perhaps might need to broaden our podcast team for this one. The strong man. We've talked a lot about men, and it does seem to be that, you know, it's a very macho. Bolsonaro has certainly used this macho, often appearing with guns, this macho image and so forth.
Like a gang, right?
Yeah. Well, let's contrast, because there are also some female political leaders, and you might argue, better. Now, it's a relatively small number. One of them, the leading lights in Merkel in Germany, obviously stepped down recently. But you do have examples it's certainly an interesting trend to contrast, this dominance of male. Here we are in 2022, coming towards the end, getting towards the mid-2020s, and we seem to be dominated by strong men, which is an interesting, perhaps worrying
Yeah, I thought it was. Maloney in itself is an interesting case in that sense, kind of breaking the trend. It was kind of. I mean, although I've got my issues with it, it was somewhat refreshing seeing a female leader rise up that far in Italy. But I mean, I think
we're not going to make necessarily the case for Le Pen and Maloney being the greatest examples of leadership, ideas-wise, perhaps. But yes.
Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand,
yeah,
quite good. On the other side, obviously not populist. She's had a lot of good press, a lot of good people saying good stuff about her and the way she handled COVID. But yeah, I can't believe Merkel seemed to have been the absolute lodestar when it comes to
this
stuff.
Maybe she's slightly it's just different in that sense, to sort of bucks the trend rather than represents her.
Merkel is my absolute political idol because I think she just got everything right. I think the thing about male and female leaders is that Merkel was, when we go back to the last election in Germany about around this time last year, it was basically a competition to see who can be the most boring, because Merkel was so boring and Germans loved that, because what they did was
Mother, you used to call her Mother, didn't they?
Yeah, Mutti. And you know, the thing was about Merkel was that if you were left or right, you could vote for her and you know that she'd get things done. And she was boring. When you heard her speak, you'd fall to sleep. But it didn't matter.
She played to her strengths, didn't she, I think,
exactly.
Merkel? I think that's an interesting thing about don't try to be someone that you're not. And again, back to let's bring it right the way back to what we started with, Sunak. You know, he's got to, any leader now, he's got to play to, you've got to work out, hopefully you know what your strengths are, play to them.
Whereas him doing the Boris stuff, it'd be ridiculous.
Exactly.
You know.
But sometimes people think they need to force it, don't they, and do things that are out of character, and it usually just comes across as not good.
I was thinking, look at every single, there's been two since her, but look at the two Tory leaders since Thatcher. They just try and model themselves on Thatcher every time. This strong, tax-cutting, handbag-carrying lady who's quite aggressive. The lady's not for turning, that whole thing, as opposed to fleshing out their own kind of, like you said, strengths, what you've got, not what you don't have.
Make the most of those. So we've covered quite a lot today in our half hour, and I think we've definitely got some scope on the different background of leaders, including the male-female analysis. So if you are listening, then please send me some ideas on who do you think makes the best leaders. Do men or women make the best leaders, political leaders? And let's see what people's thoughts are on that. And we'll discuss that and quite a few other things in the future.
Yep.
Agreed?
Sounds good.
Thank you for your time. Bye, everyone. See you later.
Bye.
See ya.